Hi, everyone. Welcome. We will get started in just a few minutes. Hi, welcome to this month's Our Community Stories. We are featuring Crest Street. My name is Laura Biediger. I work with the City of Durham Neighborhood Improvement Services and the Equitable Community Engagement Strategist. And this is the fourth in our series of Our Community Stories. We will also be live streaming this event on our Facebook page, Durham Community Engagement. So you can also, share that with your friends now who might want to watch and comment there. And it will also be there after today. And we'll also share a recording on the city's YouTube page. Anthony, will you go to the next slide, please?
Yes.
So again, today we are recording and all of our past recordings are also available on the city's YouTube page. If you have any questions or comments, please share in the chat here, or if you're watching this as a recording, you can still please share on Facebook or in YouTube. I'm part of the city's community engagement team, and this is a chance for you to engage around our community's history. So especially if you have questions today that we can try to answer during the session, or if you have comments or other stories that you would like to share about Crest Street, please do so, because this is a chance for all of us to learn and share about these communities. Also, we are learning. So again, if you have other perspectives on history or things that we're leaving out, if we get dates wrong or something like that, feel free to nicely correct us. But there's a lot of history and we're trying to cover it in a short amount of time. So just help us to do that. And thank you as always for being kind and respectful and patient in this process. Next, please. Again, just a recap of where these stories are come from and the work that we're doing outside of this. The city has been working on equitable community engagement, especially for the last 2 years. We've been doing it for a long time, but really focusing on the last 2 years. And what this is about for the city is really making sure that all voices are heard in the engagement that we are doing. And so to do that, we really need to focus on specific communities that historically and still today are often underrepresented and are not heard in our city's engagement processes. So some of the things that the city is doing are working together with other city departments to do engagement within communities, working with community partners to lead engagement, because the people who know best how to lead engagement are your community members, your local community organizers. And another piece is what we're sharing today is an understanding of the communities that aren't often represented in our city's processes, or especially today is a great story of how a community really fought and then worked with governments to change a process that was really going to affect their neighborhood and community. So learning more about the histories of all the different areas of Durham. Next, please. Today we have Anthony Patterson, who is a resident of Crest Street in Durham and grew up there, and his family grew up there. And he has so much information to share with us about that. So we're looking forward to hearing that, and I will turn it over to Anthony.
Thank you, Laura. Hello, everyone. My name is Anthony Patterson. Um, I am a documentary artist, and most of my work is centered around painting, but my practice expands into storytelling, installation, and photography. I have exhibited across the Carolinas. I've had multiple artist residencies throughout the Triangle area. I've taught small classes, led workshops, participated in panel discussions, and co curated in partnership with the Black on Black Project. I have recently just completed a year-long internship at the Center for Documentary Studies, where I was an emerging documentary artist. And I am currently the new education and outreach coordinator for the Durham Art Guild. My work in total is aimed to bring the conversations that I talk about in my artwork and extend it beyond the pictorial plane. So, how did I come to this information, right? Well, not only am I a Durham native, but I am born and raised in the Crest Street community. And Crest Street, for those that are not familiar, is if you're coming off of the Durham Freeway and you take exit 15B onto Fulton Street, you will kind of pass by Crest Street without really noticing, especially if you're going to the Duke University Hospital, if you're going to the VA hospital. And there's this quick turn right off of Fulton Street, right before you get to the VA hospital. And there's this small community over here. And a lot of people, they use it to try to bypass traffic on Irwin Road and Fulton Street. But this neighborhood over here has been around for a very long time, dating all the way back to about 1863. And to be even more into the history is that the area that where you see maybe like the Duke parking deck and Elba Street and Pratt Street, and even across the on Fulton Street where there is a surgery building, a lot of that land used to be part of the original neighborhood, which was called Hickstown. Hickstown was started, was incorporated in 1887. And Hickstown derived its name from Hawkins Hicks, who lived on Mulberry Street. Now, Mulberry Street doesn't exist anymore today, but if you look at where the Wells Fargo is on West Main Street and go towards maybe the food line that is a little bit further down the road, that would have been Mulberry Street. And if you pay attention to the ethnography of the area, there are a lot of mulberry trees around that side of Main Street. So you kind of, just to get the gist, this is part of West Durham, and it's a part where a lot of people were gathering around at the time due to the West Durham Lumber Company. But in 1863, Hawkins Hicks was married to Jefferson Browning, who was a large landholder in West Durham. He worked for the West Durham Lumber Company. So when he passed away, he left a large portion of land to his sons. And Hawkins Hicks, who was in a common law marriage, ended up suing her sons in order to get some land out of the marriage. So that is how we have Hickstown. Following 1863, Black people settled this land. And over time, with businesses on Broad Street and Ninth Street, more people started to congregate in this area. So I want to show these slides next, which are, this is pretty typical of like what Hickstown would look like around the 1950s. So you see that there are houses that, pretty wooden houses and kind of typical for the time period for a lot of Black neighborhoods. Housing that may have been made out of maybe scrap wood, small houses, large yards, dirt roads. This is another example of the salvage material that was in the construction. And here's like an example of some unpaved roads. So in the distance, you see that there is the VA hospital. So around this time, you have a lot of families, a lot of large families, and there's even still evidence of this in the community today, where you might have distant cousins living next to you. Or, for example, my grandfather lives up the street from me, My aunt lives beside him, and I have another aunt who lives down the hill from him. And then I have distant cousins through marriage that live all across the neighborhood. So it was pretty much like that even in the 1950s, where this was a community oriented neighborhood that people felt safe in. But people from the outside looking in did not understand how this was a safe neighborhood when there were dirt roads, there were terrible looking houses, but it didn't quite describe the character of the people. And in Hickstown, there were things that some people could not really afford, like indoor plumbing, or certain parts of the neighborhood was underdeveloped rather than if there was a home there. But that doesn't, again, it doesn't really equate to what the characteristics of the people were. This right here is Nunn Store. Nunn Store was one of the institutions in the neighborhood that a lot of people congregated around. Nunn's store was ran by Rube Nunn, who was, a really cool person in the neighborhood. And he had things like grocery in this store. There was grocery, there were pool tables, there were card games. It was just a place where people could go and relax and have fun. So this is outside of Nunn's store, and you see people just having fun, doing what they do, sometimes in their Sunday best, just cutting the food, doing how they feel to be comfortable. But that wasn't the only institution in the neighborhood. So we have New Bethel Baptist Church. So New Bethel Baptist Church was started in 1877 out of a home of Rebecca Lyons, and she wanted to start a Sunday school. And then that Sunday school grew to the point where some funding needed to be raised to include a church. And Reverend John Scales in 1879 created this wooden church that you see here. That wooden church goes on to get rebuilt in 1930. And then it moves from the area that it was near West Lumber Durham Company to Crest Street in 1960. Not only a church, but there was also a school. So Hickstown School was being deconstructed in the 1920s. I know that there was some people that were educated in the neighborhood at Hickstown School, but a lot of people didn't really get to utilize Hickstown School because then it got built to be a brick building, which was Hickstown Elementary School. And this building still stands today. It's on Crest Street. And if you go and see and look at the building now, you still see where there are letters for Hickstown Elementary School. Interesting thing about this building was built in the 1950s, but was rarely used because Durham had started busing kids over in different neighborhoods. For example, if this school would still have been around, I myself, born in 1995, would have went to this elementary school, but I went to EK Poe. My mom went to EK Poe. A lot of people of my mother's generation in the neighborhood went to other neighborhood schools outside of Crest Street. So if you have this wonderful neighborhood that is very, very old and important and just full of life, here comes a idea to help try to clear these kind of neighborhoods. When I looked at information from the Federal Highway Administration, they describe neighborhoods like Crest Street as slums and blighted areas and congested areas. And that's not really the case because those, if they do appear to be slums or blighted areas, it happened through systematic racism, not through because of what the people did to their own doings. Matter of fact, most of the times you see a lot of people in these communities upkeeping what they already have. But if they was to receive some help, then maybe their situation would look better from the outside looking in. So that was that was more of motivation for people to try to support the building of 147. Now, the largest Black neighborhood in Durham was Hayti. And if you look on this redlining map from 1937, you see that Hayti was a very large area. But where is Crest Street? Crest Street is all the way up here in West Durham. That's pretty much a big distance. Something else that you'll notice when looking at this map is that if you look at all of the redlined areas, they are on either side of a railroad track. And if you look at the patterns of the Durham Freeway, it mimics the railroad patterns, not by coincidence. So you have these areas that are being neglected in the first place, and then you take this idea of running a freeway in the city to clear these congested areas, which so happen to be these red line areas. So many things started to add up. In 1954, we see that plans for the East-West Expressway, also known as the Durham Freeway in 147, appears in thoroughfare plans for the city. And one of the first places that the Durham Freeway was going to impact was Hayti. And Hayti does not exist anymore. I remember looking through some of the Rubenstein Library's archives and seeing that there were information sheets put in people's mailboxes saying the plan, and it would tell people what to do when this highway was going to come through and how this was going to affect them and what they need to do. A lot of people lost their homes. A lot of people don't have anything except for memories, and they get displaced around the city. Around the same time, or as the People's Alliance papers has suggested, that in the city of Durham, public housing was created at the same time as the Durham Freeway. So a lot of residents from Hayti were moved into public housing, and these residents protested against the public housing because it was less than what they were living in before. And this becomes a pattern all throughout the city. Another neighborhood that is in between Hayti and Crest Street would have been Brookstown, and Brookstown does not exist either. So there's just a shuffling of Black people going on around the city around between the 60s up until maybe 75. And around 75, you see that the construction for the Durham Freeway stops at a halt. The federal government suggested that there should be an environmental impact statement created to assess what was really going on in the city. For those that know, the obvious history of Durham is that we were a tobacco city. So our air quality was very terrible. So then if you add cars, to this mass transit, there were going to be way more carbon monoxide and CO2 chemicals in the air and things that would just lead to air pollution. So it was going to make the situation worse. So there was a halt. But what also was a halt was that the construction had stopped on Main Street at the intersection of Main Street and 9th Street, right at that underpass that if you are familiar with West Durham, you'll see. And since construction had stopped, there was room for a grassroots movement to figure out what was going to happen with the next neighborhood that was in line, which would have been Crest Street. And on this map, you see that the red is the Durham Freeway, East-West Expressway, and this yellow is Crest Street. It was designed to go completely through the neighborhood, and it was going to wipe us out just as what was happening all over the city, as well as the state and the country nationwide. People like my grandfather, Willie Patterson, on your left, and Reverend Lori Reed on the right, they came together to form the Save Our Church and Community coalition, in which rallied for support to try to do something to help preserve our neighborhood. And what they started was a movement that not only were just them two, but involved the entire community and the city and also the state to be able to come together and find a way to stay on this land. This is a video from the 1989 Nancy Susan Reynolds Award out of Winston-Salem that speaks about, what was going on during the time. And I'll play this. It's about 5 minutes.
If the highway had been built according to the first plans, it would have completely destroyed the total community, because it was designed to come straight through the community, and that would have wiped it out completely.
This is where I was born, and this is where I was reared. These are where my people are. I love them. This is my church. This was home. When a man has to run from home, where is it that he can go?
Someone asked me, well, you don't have anything up there to save, but you think about the material and forget people. This is wrong. People come first. People come first. No, we didn't have anything to save so far as material was concerned, but we did have people, a community. To save a community is worthwhile.
Substandard housing made life on Crest Street pretty hard on most of the residents, and the city wanted an expressway. Negotiations started to move forward.
The community needed improvement. We never really advocated that we weren't going to move. Our plan was preserve the community, and that's exactly what we did. In our meetings behind closed doors, we had already said, if the neighborhood had to move, let's move it in a unit. So they played right into our hands.
The first thing that Reed and Patterson's newly formed Save Our Church and Community Group did was hire Michael Calhoun and Alice Ratliff to represent them in the legal battle ahead. Mr. Calhoun says he'll never forget their first meeting with the opposition.
Early on in this process, when the state and the federal government, this was a road that was 90% federal funds, came in and said, we're going to build the road again. We sent in the official complaints, and they referred us to the local representatives from the Federal Department of Transportation over in Raleigh. And TAP, Willie Patterson, was there, and Reverend Reed. We went over there, and they had a room all ready for us, and these beautiful maps spread out over the wall showing the expressway in all its glory. And they brought in all these engineers and right-of-way folks, one after the other, and gave this long dog and pony show. Basically at the end said, well, we're sorry that this is going to do this to your community, but you can see there are really no other alternatives. This is the only thing we can do. And there was a long pause there, and then Tapp looked around and he said, well, I hope that I don't offend anybody in this room, but if this road was going through your neighborhood, you can bet your fat asses you'd find another way to do it. And there was this, and about a full minute of silence there. But it's sort of like there, people started to get the idea that this community was not going to just take the usual story that, well, you're the ones that have to go to make the way for this public good, that this community was going to stand up and fight it.
In order to break down the type of fighting that we did not want, we invited those people here in this church, in the fellowship hall. Believe it or not, but we cooked for them, we fed them, and we sat down together like human beings and worked the thing out. This is what we did. We had to go. We had a lot of going to do here, there, and everywhere, but we stopped running and had them to come here. And here is where, under the atmosphere of the church, is where every agreement was made, not in some office somewhere, right down there in the fellowship hall. Willie played a tremendous role in leadership. I had no help. We were battling alone. We were fighting hard alone just to hold ourselves together, almost at the point, really, almost at the point of giving up. Willie gave me hope, and we joined hands together.
Reverend Reed has always been my leaning post, so to speak. when I was a child growing up, I learned the difference between right and wrong. And that when I went away and came back here, went into service and came back here, he was here carrying a load by himself. I saw the community shortcomings, the very things that he had been involved in much longer than I did. And my involvement was to get in and try to do what I could to bring about some changes in the community. So the two of us just grew closer and closer because we were after the same thing, to better the life of the people that are living here in Crest Street. And I think we achieved that.
So some things that I want to kind of point on is that the partnership between my grandfather, Willie Patterson, and Reverend Reed. It was, for me doing my research, it seemed like it was like a perfect dynamic duo. In 1975, my granddad had just got out of the Air Force after serving 22 years. Part of his time in service, he spent 4 years at the Defense Intelligence Agency. And then also in 1975, when he returns home, he enrolls into North Carolina Central University studying political science. So you have this incredibly intelligent person paired with someone who is a really gifted speaker in Reverend Reed. And they come in, they bring their skills together in order to lead and take charge of like what is going on. So there is just this real synergy between them. And I hope that y'all saw the respect that each one had for each other, and what one couldn't do, the other could do. And so with this two-person team at the forefront, it just had this immense effect around the city. And coming out of that, it galvanized a lot of support around the city. The People's Alliance is still around today, and they ended up printing up shirts that said "Stop the Expressway," as well as signs like this, which is like "Save Our Neighborhood," the Crest Street Community Council. The Save Our Church and Community organization morphed into the Crest Street Community Council, since all the meetings, as Reverend Reed said, were featured in the church, which sat on Crest Street. And so the neighborhood really rallied behind saving these institutions in the neighborhood, which would bring much more attention to it than just houses. It's a school, it's a church, and it's us, and it's all of us together fighting for a different cause. And so many other people saw what was going on in Crest Street that they wanted to help out. This is a t-shirt design by Brown Griffith Little for the People's Alliance. This was something that they would wear. And I don't really know the exact date of this design, but I would say it had to have been around the late 70s. This is from a Crest Street March/festival in 78. I found this, interesting how I found this image. I was walking around in Golden Belt where my studio was, and I saw that there was images that Durham Herald Sun had donated to the Chapel Hill Library. And so they pulled one of these images out and they blew it up and they had it on display right near my studio. And at the time I was walking with a friend, another arts administrator, Michael Williams, and he said, "Hey, there's an image on the wall about your neighborhood." And I said, "Whoa, I've never seen this picture before at all." And then the first thing I noticed is that my mom is in the picture, and I dated it. And I said, "Whoa, I definitely know where my mom is." And I'm gonna move the mouse. My mom is right here. She was 17 at the time. So I took a picture and I sent it to my sister. I said, "Guess who's in this photo?" And she said, "Oh, that's mom in there. I've never seen this photo before." I showed my mom. She said, "I still got those glasses in the attic." And I asked her to tell me a little bit more about this. And she said, "Well, we marched from one part of the neighborhood down Irwin Road to where the construction had stopped at that intersection between Main and 9th Street. And I tried to find the article written about it, but the photographer took this on one angle, and my granddad said he was at the front of the line at another place. But this image just shows you that this was much more than just my granddad and Reverend Reed. It involved a lot more people, and it was something that was a real movement that most don't know about. So this movement that garnered a lot of press from around the state, a lot of things going on, like in Winston-Salem that was going through something similar with highways, and even around the country, you know, things going on in DC. The Crest Street Community Council worked with the Durham City Council and the Highway Administration to be able to find a way to mitigate a plan that was racially discriminatory. So Crest Street Community Council's legal team had found out that this freeway violated the Civil Rights Act of 64, Title VI. And what Title VI states is that residents and communities and people in general have to be involved in a process that involves federally funded projects. So beyond reasonable doubt, there is proof that when you look at the history of the Durham Freeway, and then you take what was going on in Durham and you compare it to, like, let's say places like in LA, and you see how freeways and highways have divided a lot of Black neighborhoods. And you look at this whole period of urban renewal, or as James Baldwin states, Negro removal, and you can clearly see that there are racially discriminatory practices on this freeway. But this was a case that was pushed all the way up to the Supreme Court to be a administrative complaint, and not further than that because a mitigation plan was created. In this photo, you see my grandfather, along with some people from the Federal Highway Administration, Reverend Reed and Miss Betty Johnson, who's also a very important figure in this movement, another spiritual leader in the movement. She also helped to form a tutorial program in the neighborhood years later. But they are signing documents that basically state what's going to happen with the neighborhood after this initial plan is made. And this is what happens. So if you look over here on the top left side of the screen, you see this red boundary. This red boundary is the original borders of the neighborhood. The yellow is what the proposed highway was going to do. And then the green is what most of the neighborhood that we have now. And the purple are the original structures in the neighborhood. So we wanted to preserve the original structures in the neighborhood, which were Hickstown School and New Bethel Baptist Church, and we got that accomplished. What this map does not really entail is the houses that were moved from one part of the neighborhood, which would have been in yellow, to over here in the green. And it also doesn't account for some of the other houses that were donated from around the Trent side of Duke, and houses that were placed over here in this new part of the neighborhood. This green part of the neighborhood was just underutilized, and it was a little bit more space to be able to add some infrastructure in. This mitigation plan also was the result of maybe about a $10 million settlement. I think it was maybe a little bit more in 1981 that included a redeveloped neighborhood with paved roads that we did not have, and houses that were better built, and 65 houses that were moved and put on better structures. Over 100 new housing units put in place with collaboration with HUD. Over 1,000 graves moved that was in a graveyard right beside our church. So these graves were moved to a different part of, it's like on LaSalle Street. So they were kind of moved back a little bit. And so from looking at these graves, and my mom had helped out with moving some of these graves, you know, we realized that how old this land actually is. For example, New Bethel Baptist Church is 141 years old. The city of Durham is 151 years old this year. That tells you how old this land really is. People have been settling this land before this church was even put together. This is a land over here that's just as precious as any other land in the city. And a lot of people have made this their home. So in order to preserve the things that we coincide around, we have to be able to find a way to kind of work our way and work through and work with different forms of government. So this was an amazing feat. A lot of press was going on around the state, and this is like just a headline from Winston-Salem Journal in '89. Both Reverend Reed and my grandfather received a Nancy Susan Reynolds Award, in which that video comes from, for community change. My grandfather also received an award from HUD, as well as write-ups in the U.S. World Reports and News in '95. And since probably '95, since I've been alive, I've saw a lot of people, a lot of Duke students, a lot of students in general, writing about what happened in our neighborhood, to be able to, write papers and write theses and so many other things to talk about, this incredible thing, this tiny neighborhood that fights against a systematic oppressive system and wins. Like, we don't really hear about these things like that. And these are images from the award ceremony. This was another recipient over here who received an award too. There were, my grandfather and Reverend Reed were a team, and there were 2 other people that won awards that year too. So now I want to kind of show a little bit more of, the after, like after the settlement and after houses have been moved and some of the construction era of the neighborhood. And this would have been part of Nassau Street, where some people were living in really rough looking apartment complexes that were later turned into duplexes. As you'll see, like here's a house that's being built on the new part of the neighborhood. And out here on the corner, there's the VA hospital. Over here is another house of construction and new things being put together. This is right on the corner of like where Nassau Street would have been. And this is a photo from our first community day in '85. And I asked my grandfather, so what happened during community day? And he says, well, we ate and we sang and we celebrated each other, but it was also a way to celebrate a new neighborhood and accomplishment and just embrace each other and create another loving aspect to what Crest Street was, what Hickstown is. And, being able to say, like, look what we did and look what we have. In the distance of this photo, you see the New Bethel Baptist Church. There is now a baseball field here. There are now houses along this street, and there's a park. And that was in '85. And here are some other images from that community day. What also came out of this mitigation plan was reutilizing the original Hickstown Elementary School. So this is now a rec center that is named after my grandfather, the W.I. Patterson Center. And on the other side, there's New Bethel Homes, L.W. Reed Homes as well. It's got a dual name. And there are homes for the elderly, as well as a couple of office spaces for the Crest Street Community Council. In this photo, I thought it was really cool that here's my grandfather standing outside of the building, which now has his name on it. And growing up, I used to always go in the rec. My time growing up in the neighborhood was in the 2000s, and I used to always feel proud of seeing my last name on the building. And I came into more of this history just by realizing that a lot of people that have moved into the neighborhood, since probably 2010 have no clue about any of this history. And so when I came home from school, similar fashion of when my grandfather came home for the military, he said, wow, we got to figure out what to do with this neighborhood. And I was figuring out, well, how can I spread, information about the neighborhood, and how can we create more community pride? Because there had been, some issues going on within the neighborhood. And so me and other community members created like a reunion, and we had people come together and celebrate just as the original community days were. So this was back on July 4th. This was also like a Black August event where I have created banners with quotes from my grandfather and Reverend Reed to have people, see what was really why it's important to dive into this history and celebrate our community. I'm also spending a lot of time with my granddad, like in this photo, and just valuing a lot of the information that has been passed between him to me. And we're both learning a lot of things about the neighborhood. And I cherish my time that I have with him. He just turned 85 in January. And it's been an amazing journey as I dive into this history and I figure out, how much deeper the story goes than I think. And I'm so forever grateful for it. And now I can open it up to anybody that has questions. Laura, is it okay if I stop sharing the screen?
Sure, you might want to leave it up just in case there are things that you want to go back to. I know we've had that experience in the past. People want to ask more questions about different photos, but Cheryl is our question lead for today.
Got you.
Hello, good afternoon.
Hey, how are you?
I'm doing well, thank you. Okay, so one question could be, Anthony, what would you change today, especially about the settlement?
That's a really interesting question. I think that I would have changed maybe how the housing was handled. And what I mean by that is with the incorporation of having public housing in the neighborhood, although it maximized a lot of people being able to live still in the neighborhood, there are some drawbacks that come back from that. Like, so some people might not like as generations go by, you get people from other parts of the neighborhood. Well, you get other people from other parts of the city moving in that don't know or don't cherish this land. And so it can lead to a lot of judgment on people that are moving into these HUD apartments or not. And it just, for me, I look at it also as an opportunity to teach more people. But I've seen that there has been judgment placed on people that don't know how special this land is. And I've also heard maybe some rumblings every now and then about, how things could have been done better with the loan situation.
Thank you. We have another question. Who or how old is the oldest living resident original to the Crest Street community?
That's interesting because I don't know. I do remember when I was probably in my teenage years, the house that is beside my granddad's used to be owned by Rube Nunn and his wife, Rosetta Webb. Rosetta Webb had lived to be 100 and maybe like 103 or 102 or something like that. She lived to be over 100 years old. And I do remember seeing her growing up. But after that, I'm not sure. I believe there are some people still in the neighborhood that are older than my granddad, but they might not live within the community. They might have moved away.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Another question we have, does Crest Street still have a lot of people like yourself who have a multi-generational history in the neighborhood?
Yeah. My best friend, Isaac, his family was raised in what was then Hickstown, and they grew up and had multiple generations in the neighborhood, and now he has kids growing up in the neighborhood. So it's really interesting to see that. Like, my mom is best friends with his mom, and they talk about growing up in the community and like how both of our families trace back to a long period of time of being in the area. So there are definitely a few other people like that.
We have another question. Where did people in the community work? Did they work at Duke?
So some people worked at Duke. A lot of people originally, like right after settlement, were working over at Irwin Mills, over on 9th Street, on Broad Street, as the VA hospital and Duke Hospital was being built. People were working at Duke as well. Um, I've even heard stories about some of the early settlers helping out with stone masonry for the Duke Chapel. So people have found ways to get employment around.
Anthony, I'm familiar with Crest Street because I had a cousin that lived in the area probably about maybe 16 years ago. How do you feel about the parking in the Crest Street community with maybe people trying to avoid paying for parking that work at Duke Hospital?
So I think that where I see more so of parking as an issue is because the streets are not wide enough to have people street parking. Um, but it starts to become a little bit more of a headache around between 3 and 5 o'clock when you see a lot of the traffic going through the neighborhood and a lot of people not really understanding it. Although you might avoid Urban Road, you still have to deal with Fulton Street. And because it's a high transit area, it's always going to be cars coming through. I know some people charge workers to park in their yard or on their driveway or around the house to kind of compensate, because I get it. Like it is a lot easier to find this neighborhood right beside it to pay for parking for someone privately rather than going to the parking deck. Um, but that's also, an advantage to a lot of people in the neighborhood that work at Duke, where they can say, I can leave my car in my driveway and I can walk to work. So it's a give and take situation.
Okay, we have another question. Are neighborhood kids still assigned to different schools?
I believe I believe most elementary school age students in Crest Street go to EK Poe. EK Poe is a neighborhood school for us because it's right on 9th Street. Um, and then I think middle schools are maybe Brockton or Rogers Her. Although the districts had changed when I was in middle school and I ended up going all the way to Githens. So I think it all depends on like how the districts are changing for schools in the city.
And we have another question that says, has there been or will there be an effort to collect oral histories from your grandfather's generation to capture individual narratives about what life was like when they were kids?
There's been oral histories taken from and collected from UNC Chapel Hill. There has been interviews conducted from youth of the neighborhood with and elders of the neighborhood in '98 through Duke Center for Documentary Studies, and that was called Community Stories. There has been a lot of information collected about the neighborhood, but my issue is that the information lies in institutions and people that are not from the neighborhood, and primarily those people are white. And so I think it's very empowering for someone like myself and my friends that grew up in the neighborhood who are Black and have ties to the area to be able to take control over our own story. So the things that I'm doing with the story, like taking photos of our community days and making paintings about our story, is almost like metaphorical resistance to the whiteness that surrounds documentary work. And so I think that we have to continue doing these things, and it has to be put in the perspective of the people that made the history.
Thank you. We have another question. Is the Crest Street Park right across from the New Bethel Church? The city recently bid the restrooms to be renovated.
I have heard that some of the restaurants will be renovated, but yes, that is Crest Street Park. Crest Street Park includes the baseball field, the basketball court, and the park that sits beside New Bethel Church. It would be great to see those renovated because I haven't seen them in use in years.
Okay, we have another question. Anthony, do you think the same resistance did not take place in Hayti because the wheels were moving faster at the end of the highway construction and they did not have as much time to organize? Or do you think there were other factors involved in the destruction of that neighborhood?
I have to still do more of my research on the temperament and the people that lived in Hayti. But from what I can observe is that because they were hit first, they didn't see it coming. And so our advantage was seeing what had happened before us and having a halt in construction due to an environmental impact statement needing to be crafted in order for the highway to continue being made. So there are a lot of things that Crest Street was able to look at and say, oh, that's precedence for us rather than being the first person hit. I'm not sure how residents would have reacted if they saw or heard of another neighborhood in the city that was affected before them. So I look at it as a situation that I would want to learn a lot more about. But I definitely can see a point where they were just caught off guard.
Okay, thank you. There's another question. Another attendee said, great presentation. Are you aware or can you speak on the role our mayor, Steve Schul, played during the freeway fight?
Oh yeah, my granddad said in 1975, that's when he met Steve Schul, and Steve Schul was a part of the People's Alliance during that time. The People's Alliance, I believe that was their first major project that they did, helping out with Crest Street. So I remember him telling me that, in an interview I had with him that, yeah, and Steve Schul is now the mayor of Durham, and he started the Independent. So he was very proud to see some of the people from that movement still impacting the city today.
Okay, there's another question. Do you and your grandfather have any plans to publish your story of Crest Street?
There were plans. He gave me a draft of a book, that was supposed to be in the early 2000s. But I've also started to work on a short film about the community history, and I'm still in the works of figuring out how do I want to really approach it. But I do think that this story needs to be expanded on and told and go more in depth of what happened in more people. For instance, like one of the things I'm really interested in is the women of Crest Street and how the women were a part of the process, so that it's not so much of my grandfather and Reverend Reed. Like there was also people like Betty Johnson and Maydell Gaddis and the women of the church and how they played a role in it, and maybe even touching a little bit more on the spiritual side of things. I remember reading something about how why it was so important to have meetings in the church and ground things in a spiritual context. So I want to definitely expand upon this.
Thank you, Anthony. We've had several requests to share your presentation. Are you able to share that with attendees if possible?
At the moment, because I do not own the rights to some of these images, I will have to check in and make sure I do everything correctly before bringing this out for more people to see that way. But I have created some work that I have on my website, aipatterson.com, where you can view some of the images that I've created, as well as looking at some of the interviews and things that I've done regarding Crest Street. There's other information out there if you go look at opendurham.com, as well as like the oral history projects through Chapel Hill. And if you go look into the libraries at Duke, there are a lot of sources out there you can get your hands on.
Okay, we have one last question. Anthony, what is the proportion of intergenerational families versus new residents currently living in the Crest Street community?
Mm. There has been a lot of new people living in the neighborhood across various racial backgrounds, but I'm starting to see a lot more um, newer, younger white families moving into the neighborhood. And it's really interesting to see like how the neighborhood is changing over time, and it makes me value the work that I do even more, so that they and other people, and they don't even have to be white, but like just other families can see why I care so much about this land over here. And hopefully I can make this history cool enough so that they will be able to dive into maybe their own family history and be empowered by the things that came before them.
Anthony, thank you so much for answering those questions. And now I'll turn it back over to Laura.
Sure, Cheryl, thank you so much for fielding all of those questions. Anthony, I had just a couple more slides after these, if you could share those.
All right.
Oh, Anthony, thank you for all of your history. I don't know if you mentioned it, but there is, I think, Anthony, is there, you said there, do you have the longer version of that video available somewhere?
Yes, I can provide a link to the longer version of the video.
Okay.
The
We can put that
foundation.
when we did it on our website. Yeah.
Yeah, I got you.
I'm sure other people just, I feel like watching both Anthony's grandfather and Reverend Reed speak, I think is just mesmerizing. So just a few things to wrap up. We will be sending a survey out today, after today or Monday, just to hear your thoughts and suggestions. I know that there were some technical difficulties for people getting on. So if you know or hear of that, please let me know. We're trying to figure out how to make this easier. If you want to see the recording right now immediately, it has been live streamed on Facebook, so it will be there. And then we will post the recording on the city's YouTube page, normally by Monday or Tuesday. You can always contact me at laura.biediger@durhamnc.gov. If you RSVP'd on our website, you received an email from me, so you'll have my contact information. Anthony, will you go to the next slide, please? Just a preview of things coming up. So again, we've been holding these sessions every month. We will be covering Hayti, which Anthony, I think, referred to a lot today, and we've often referred to a lot because that was such a large community and has so much history there. So that will be Friday, November 13th. If you have any stories or things that you would really like to see covered in that very small amount of time that we have to cover that neighborhood, please let me know. We'll try to include it. We will also be having a recap session in December. So far we have talked about Walltown, West End, Bragtown, today Crest Street, next month Hayti. And we thought for December it would be nice to kind of revisit those neighborhoods. And if anyone else has other stories that they would like to share, if you have photos you would like to share, because that's, a big obstacle is trying to digitize a lot of the memories from these communities, please let us know. We can help to figure out the digitization piece and how to get your story shared. So if you or someone you know has stories they would like to share from these neighborhoods, please let us know. And then also, I have on the slide the neighborhoods that we're still hoping to hear from this year. Brookstown, I know that Cheryl has been talking with one resident from there. We're still trying to find people from the Albright community to share their history. East End, the Bottom, and probably also Lion Park. Lion Park was covered a little bit in West End, but we kind of wanted to have a space specifically for that. So if you know of anyone who would be interested in sharing information about those neighborhoods, please let us know, and please include contact information. One more slide. So thank you to everyone who helped today, and especially to Anthony and to his grandfather and to all the resources that were featured here, and Cheryl or Q&A, and Fallon for managing the chat. They're just invaluable. And I left off Amber. I need to add Amber next time. Amber Wade from the mayor's office helps us set up Zoom, and that's super helpful. So thank you again. Our website is durhamcommunityengagement.org, where you can RSVP for future events and see other information of things that we're working on. And have a good Friday, a good weekend. Thanks, Anthony.
Thank you.
Thanks, Anthony. Thanks, Laura. Thanks, Fallon. And